Today I'm with Ben Page, who's the Chief Executive of global research firm Ipsos MORI. Ben, I want to talk about two things. I want us to start with you telling me what's happening in the world and the things that board members need to think about. And then I want us to move on to what to do with data. So let's start with what's happening in the world.
Well, I think the big picture is just huge uncertainty, I think. But what we find interesting is we measure consumer confidence and how societies are feeling in about 27 countries every month, including all of the G20 plus the Middle East. And what's really striking is just the diversity. So overall, the picture, of course, is that we saw a great crash, and overall public confidence, consumer confidence across the world has been affected. But what is now becoming clear is how we're emerging into a sort of 2 or even 3 speed world, where even in like somewhere like Europe, you'll see huge differences with the Germans, 15 times more likely to feel good about their economy than, say, the Spanish.
So what does it mean if you're in the boardroom trying to take a decision?
I think you need to look at the data. You need to be clear about which markets you're in and what the direction of travel is, because it's actually getting harder and harder in some ways to generalise. We can say that the developing world is getting, is the place to put your money, and places like Europe aren't. But it's actually more complicated than that, because certain places in Europe are great and certain places in the developing world are certainly not.
And if I'm sitting in the boardroom trying to decide where to put my money, or where I should, not my money, the company's money, and I'm trying to be a good steward, what should I be asking?
Well, I think one of the things that's clear is how many non-execs find themselves suddenly in a position of some responsibility and authority, and yet sometimes rather badly equipped to ask the right questions. So my first sort of piece of advice to non-execs would be trust, but verify. Go and ask to see the stuff behind the data. You may not be an expert on the industry that you're now a non-executive of, but question some of the assumptions. Ask to see some of the raw data. And another key point: if it's interesting, it's usually wrong.
All right. Well, let's talk about trust and verify.
Okay.
As a director, I'm sitting around the table. I get handed these really lovely reports. How do I know what's missing? How do I verify?
Well, I think the first thing is to ask where the data comes from. I mean, one of the classics, of course, and I think that that everybody has sort of grasped since 2008, is that most predictions are wrong. There's an extensive academic literature on this, but the evidence appears to be that experts are only about 5% more right than the man in the street. And if you look at, say, forecasts of oil prices over the last 30 years, they're predictions of people who spend their entire lives studying commodity prices and everything else, and you ask them what's going to happen to oil prices for the next 10 years. They've nearly always been wrong,
so
for example. I mean, that is the data.
So now I've gotten data, and basically the experts don't know what they're talking about. How do I decide?
Well, I think the point is to be aware, try to get some idea about margins, that, look at scenarios, nobody can actually predict the future. There are very few things we can be dead certain about. Demographics, often a bit better, and actually the meteorologists, the weather forecasters, claim that they're more accurate than the economists when it comes to forecasting.
Are they?
You'll have to ask them. I'm an opinion pollster, but I think.
What's your opinion?
I think my point is that we do know that generally, expert forecasts are likely to have a lot of variance attached to them. So look at those scenarios, and I think one thing that boards should do a bit more of is not so much just sort of straight line forecasting, showing sales rising and rising, but actually what happens if they don't? What happens if a new competitor comes in?
Scenario building.
Scenario building,
and
because the great thing about scenarios is that all of the scenarios, of course, are wrong. Right. But all scenarios, if they're developed well, are likely to contain elements of what the future will hold, and that's, I think, a good discipline. And it's more about being adaptive, being flexible, because we've just learned since 2008 that most of the virtually everybody was blindsided by it, and I think we may be overcompensating because humanity has a tendency to fight the last war endlessly. But at the moment, I'd say better safe than sorry. So
what we're looking for is data that we verify.
Yeah.
And that we also are able to have that inform our risk registers, and that we're doing more scenario building.
Absolutely. And, if it's interesting, it's wrong. If that looks, why are Britain is going to be 10 times wealthier than Germany within 20 years? It sounds absolutely insane. It probably is. And that's the thing. If it sounds too good to be true, it usually is. And if it's really interesting and seems just counterintuitive, trust, but verify. Go and look at the raw data.
Ben, thank you.
No problem.